to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's an honor to serve as director of the museum here in Grand Rapids and the library in Ann Arbor. This afternoon is a special program in honor of our 30th anniversary, and we're delighted to have all of you here. It's a great pleasure for us to have Susan Ford Bales, daughter of President and Mrs. Ford, with us today. She is a highly articulate spokesperson on issues related to breast cancer, and with her mother, Betty Ford, helped establish October as National Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Susan has been extremely active with the Betty Ford Center and its programs to address addiction, and served as chairman of its board for 5 years. Susan also has a very special role as the official ship sponsor of the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier CVN-78 that is under construction. This new Ford-class carrier will be christened in 2013 and commissioned in 2015. Susan is also a trustee of the Ford Presidential Foundation and serves as co-chair of the foundation's program committee. She is an avid supporter of all we do at the library and museum and played the key role in convincing our speaker to fit this into his schedule today. Along with her brother Steve, Susan has stepped forward to represent the Ford family at many events in Grand Rapids and across the country, giving very generously of her time and talent. We're very honored to have her with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Susan Ford Bales, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to the Foundation trustees, Joe Calvaruso, special guests, Donna Randall, Al Freely, Gleaves Whitney, members of the museum staff and volunteers, and congratulations on your 30th museum anniversary. Uncle Dick, I love seeing you as always, ladies and gentlemen. In the twilight of his life, Dad often asked to reflect on his legacy and how he thought historians would judge his decades of public service. His consistent response surprised many. Certainly, Dad was proud of how he healed our nation following the greatest constitutional crisis since the Civil War. And he was equally proud of the example of bipartisan leadership he set in Congress and as president. But part of his legacy, about which Dad was proudest, was the group of men and women that formed the core of his administration, who then went on to serve the American people with exceptional and distinguished service. And no one, absolutely no one, better illustrates Dad's pride in this remarkable group than our special guest today. Our guest, with his unusual humility, often describes with amazement when Dad summoned him into the Commerce Department to become one of Dad's closest advisors. But rest assured, Dad knew exactly why this humble Texan was so extraordinary. He went on to serve Dad with distinction, and then, as the saying goes, the rest is history. In the years after his service to Dad, he served as 61st United States Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, White House Chief of Staff for 2 presidents, Chairman of the Iraq Study Group, Personal Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and proudly one of our fellow trustees of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. A philosopher once observed, quote, "The best impression one gets of a leader and of his character is by looking at those closest around him." If in the end the legacy and leadership of our guest and his remarkable service to America, then please know that the 38th President of the United States would be bursting with pride today. Thus, it is a personal joy and honor to introduce to you a statesman, a world leader, a man of peace, a man of integrity, and I'm very proud to say, one of my dad's dear friends. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Baker.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Susan, for a very warm and generous introduction, and thank you as well for all you have done to nurture and honor the wonderful legacy of both your dad and your mom. Dick Ford, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me say to begin with that it's a great pleasure for me to be back in Grand Rapids. I've been here a number of times, and I'm delighted to be back, particularly to celebrate this 30th anniversary of the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum, because this library and museum also does an extremely wonderful job of maintaining the legacy, and not just the legacy, but the lessons of a man, a president who was much more than just a man of his times. Gerald Ford was a great and timeless American who day in and day out demonstrated characteristics that will always serve, I think, as models for our leaders, those leaders of today as well as those leaders of tomorrow. But before I talk about his legacy, I would first like to state, as a matter of personal privilege, if you will, a simple but obvious fact. I wouldn't be standing here today were it not for the faith that President Ford showed in me when I was his Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Because at the time, my political and public service resume was extremely thin. But President Ford saw something, I guess, more in me than just a Texas lawyer with a modest background in regional politics. Following the recommendations of Raj Morton and Dick Cheney, Stu Spencer and Bob Teeter, President Ford selected me to take over for his friend Jack Stiles after Stiles had been killed in an automobile accident. Stiles, of course, was President Ford's delegate hunter in that very spirited 1976 Republican primary against Ronald Reagan. And later, of course, after Raj became ill with cancer, President Ford asked me to chair the President Ford Committee in the general election against Jimmy Carter. Those of you old enough to remember will remember that those races, both of them, were really historic races settled by razor-thin margins, both the race for the nomination and the general election contest. And they served as springboards for my career in national politics and public service. And so, my friends, I know you will understand when I say, thank you, Mr. President, for the confidence that you showed in me at a critical point in my career. But more importantly, thank you, Mr. President, for the confidence that you showed in America and the job that you did for America at a very difficult time in our nation's history. Again, for those of us old enough to remember, Jerry Ford inherited a deeply troubled country when he placed his hand on that Bible on August the 9th, 1974, to take the oath of office. President Nixon, of course, had been forced to resign. Inflation and recession were presenting the country with what at the time was arguably its worst economic time since the Great Depression. The Cold War was heating up as confidence in Uncle Sam was trending down. Americans at that time were quite jaded toward a political system that many felt had let them down and let them down badly. Our national psyche was taking a beating. Countless people worried that the American dream was a thing of the past. And into this national morass came a man with a true moral compass. He exemplified the plain talk of a Midwesterner, the resolution of a Michigan Wolverine offensive lineman, the bravery of a Pacific War hero, and the intellect of a Yale Law School graduate. He was all of that, but he was much, much more. He was not the most glib of our national leaders, nor the most elegant, but President Ford had something that was much more important. He had character. Jerry Ford, as the country, indeed the entire world, would soon learn, maintained traits that we associate with the Boy Scouts. He was trustworthy, he was loyal, he was helpful, he was reverent, Of course, this shouldn't have come as a surprise to the American people, because after all, he was the first American president who had actually earned his Eagle Scout rank. For President Ford, decency and honor were more than merely words that politicians throughout the ages have repeated in their high-minded speeches. For President Ford, they were ideals, ideals to be incorporated into the way one lived one's life. And so today I would like to examine with you 5 of what I believe were President Ford's very best traits, traits that contributed to his effective brand of leadership. I think they're instructive to consider at this point in our country's history, ladies and gentlemen, because these very traits are needed today. They're needed in Washington, where once again confidence in our country and in our elected officials is waning. And let me start with the leadership trait that I think was Jerry Ford's most important: selflessness. Like most politicians, President Ford understood that election meant self-preservation. But unlike too many today, he was unwilling to sacrifice his principles in order to satisfy the whims of the electorate. Faced with an enormous dilemma about whether or not to pardon President Nixon in the aftermath of Watergate, President Ford did not look to his political advisors for advice. He knew what they would say. He knew they would say, pardoning President Nixon will kill you at the polls in 2 years. And it certainly did, just 2 short years later. Instead, he did the very same thing that we tell our children to do when they're confronted with a difficult problem. He looked to his own heart for guidance. And after he found the answer, he explained it this way to his countrymen. My conscience, he said, tells me that it is my duty to not only proclaim domestic tranquility, but to use every means that I have to ensure it. That courageous act, when the buck truly did stop at his desk, allowed the nation to move forward from a very, very troubling time. And that characteristic of selflessness, I believe, is the reason that President Ford was able to heal our injured country, even if it did ultimately cost him his job. A second leadership trait that President Ford exhibited was bipartisanship. We hear a lot of talk about that today. A moment ago, I told you that President Ford was a man of principle, and he was, no doubt about it. He was particularly worried about the influence of an ever-growing government and what it was having, the influence it was having on our country. He expressed those thoughts very, very eloquently. He said, if the government is big enough to give you everything you want, it is big enough to take away everything you have. And of course, in that, he was absolutely right. But President Ford was also a creature of the Congress, let's not forget. He served for more than 8 years as the House Minority Leader before he became Vice President and then President. As well as anyone, President Ford understood that our democracy is based upon negotiation, and it's based upon compromise, and it's based upon agreement. Truth, he once said, is the glue that holds government together. Compromise, he said, is the oil that makes government go. President Ford may have had political adversaries because they come with the turf, but he didn't have any political enemies. He knew how to disagree agreeably. President Ford understood that bipartisanship is important not only for getting things accomplished, but for making sure that they don't get undone when there are the inevitable shifts of power in Washington, D.C. A third leadership trait of President Ford was dignity. President Ford was a fair and just human being who seemed to intuitively know what the right thing to do was. I will never forget Election Day 1976. The president had overcome a 30 percentage point deficit in the polls, and for the first time almost during that campaign, a win seemed possible. He had busted his tail in a campaign that was stacked against him from the very day that he took office. On the night of the election, that afternoon, 5:30 in the afternoon, I went in with Stu Spencer and Bob Teeter to give him some of the exit polls, which weren't that promising, but they weren't all that bad at that time. And I thought to myself that I might actually be able to light up the victory cigar that President Ford had given me that afternoon. And it wasn't until early the next morning, after 3 o'clock in the morning, that we learned that Jimmy Carter had won the closest presidential election since 1916. The election was so close that had fewer than 10,000 votes shifted in Ohio and Hawaii out of a total of 81 million votes cast in the country, President Ford would have won the vote in the Electoral College and thereby won the election. Now, despite that razor-thin margin, the president was very stoic in defeat. He had worked very hard. So hard, you'll remember that he had lost his voice. Very, very hard, and he had come so very, very close. Yet he graciously accepted the result. His longtime friend, the former St. Louis Cardinals catcher Joe Garagiola, who sat with the president as they watched the election returns roll in, said that he'd seen former Cardinals great Enos Slaughter get more upset with an umpire saying strike two than Gerald Ford did when he realized he was not going to win a presidential election. But he refused to ask for recounts, even though many of his supporters had implored him to do so. President Ford was a man of honor. And because he had lost the popular vote, he did not want to put the country through the agony of a recount. His fourth leadership trait was humor. He had the inner confidence of someone who could laugh at himself. Of course, that was important because Hollywood was always trying to make him the butt of their jokes. As Americans, though, grew to know him, they witnessed a leader whose sharp, self-deprecating humor could ease some very serious situations. One of those times came after he accepted the resignation of Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz for telling an offensive joke. A little later, after being introduced at an event by Bob Hope, President Ford wisecracked, "I have only one thing to say about a program that calls for me to follow Bob Hope. Ridiculous. Bob Hope has stage presence, comedy timing, and the finest writers in the business. I'm standing here in a rented tuxedo with 3 jokes from Earl Butz." Ford's brilliance was in showing the country that he was not thin-skinned. After all, who among us, after being wrongly cast as a clumsy buffoon in countless Chevy Chase skits, could quip, "I haven't felt this good since I fell down an airport ramp"? A fifth and final leadership trait is one that he demonstrated side by side with his wonderful First Lady, Betty. That, of course, was their perseverance in the face of adversity. Life didn't always go according to storybook plans for Jerry and Betty Ford, particularly when it came to her battles with substance abuse. But rather than do the easy thing and give in to her addictions, Betty Ford chose the difficult path. She confronted head-on those demons that were her problem, and she conquered them. And then she did something even more heroic. She helped others do the same thing. With President Ford always supporting her, she was able to turn trials into triumphs. If ever there was an example of how we Americans should respond to the inevitable challenges we will all face at one time or another, the Fords were it. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect upon the legacy of Gerald Ford, it is extremely short-sighted to simply remember him as the post-Watergate president. Although he had only 29 months in the White House, he used his time wisely and productively to confront the monumental issues that faced him when he took office. He helped us restore our national senses and our sensibility. He healed our nation. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, President Ford continued the country's policy of détente with the Soviet Union and China. This played a vital role in easing the tensions of the Cold War at that time. And he did this at the same time that he was helping restore America's confidence in its role in international affairs following the collapse of Cambodia and the fall of Saigon. He was also able to focus the attention of the world and his country on other important matters. He persuaded Israel and Egypt to accept an interim truce agreement, the first ever for the two countries. He was the first president to begin to emphasize the need for regulatory reform and the first president to call for a national energy policy. He was an early supporter of majority rule in South Africa, and he was a strong proponent of equal rights for women. Did he accomplish everything that he set out to accomplish? No. But he reversed our course and he moved the country forward against strong and difficult headwinds. If there is a tragedy in President Ford's brief term as president, it is not based on anything that he did while he was in the White House, nor is it based on anything that he didn't do. No, the tragedy of President Ford's service is that the American people did not give him a full term in office. Had they done so, I am sure that his already sizable footprint in American history would have been even larger. Why do I say that? Because at his very core, Gerald Ford was a leader, one who was guided by a clear conscience and by a dogged determination to see his country at its very best. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely doubt that there's one person in this room today who doesn't wish that more of our elected officials demonstrated President Ford's leadership qualities. President Ford did what he thought was right. He did what he thought was right even when he knew it was going to cost him public support. He served our nation when bipartisanship was more than just an empty slogan, and he was a leading practitioner of it. His perseverance and dignity, even in the face of the very toughest of challenges, remain examples upon which I think we can all draw and upon which the American people can draw. Today, more than 34 years after he left an office that he did not initially seek, but graciously accepted, we remember Gerald Ford as an honest, ethical, and talented public servant. We remember him as a leader with unquestionable character and integrity. But more importantly, perhaps, at least I remember him as a truly lovely human being. A truly lovely human being who always put his country's interest ahead of his own. And so, as a result, I am absolutely convinced that history is going to be very good to President Gerald R. Ford and will always reflect upon his tenure with admiration and with respect. Our country would be far better off today if our elected officials could call upon those traits that define President Ford's leadership as they confront the difficult challenges that lay ahead of this country. Thank you all. May God bless you, and may God bless this country that Gerald Ford loved so much and served so very, very well. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We have some interesting questions that have come in thus far, and if you have additional ones, feel free to pass them to the side aisles. Two of my colleagues are there ready to pick them up. But let's start with one first. What role did you play in Ford's 1976 presidential campaign?
Well, I was his Deputy Secretary of Commerce. I'd been there about 6 months when, as I mentioned in my remarks, his delegate hunter in the contest for the nomination against Ronald Reagan was killed in an automobile accident. And President Ford asked me to come over to the President Ford Committee and be the delegate hunter in the contest for the nomination, which I did. And by the way, that was an extraordinarily interesting convention and primary contest because it was the last really contested convention of either major political party, 1976 in Kansas City. And I think we only won the nomination by some 100 delegate votes out of 3,000 or so that were on the floor of the convention. A very narrow win for an incumbent president. But of course, Ronald Reagan, Governor Reagan, had been running for president 2 or 3 times before. He was an extraordinarily tough competitor and challenger. And we felt fortunate to win the nomination, even though we won it narrowly. Then we started after the nomination. President Ford asked me to chair his general election campaign against Jimmy Carter because, as I said, Rogers Martin, who'd been chairman, developed cancer. We started out 25, 30 points behind. On election day, the two candidates were dead even. We only lost by 10,000 votes out of 81 million votes that were cast. So those close elections are tougher to lose, quite frankly, sometimes than the blowouts. But I was chairman of the President Ford Committee in the general election.
Okay. One on the relationship with President Nixon. Did President Ford consult with President Nixon on foreign policy, and were they friends?
I can't answer that because I was in the campaign and not really in the White House. I was over at Commerce for 6 months, as I said, and I was the acting Secretary of Commerce. But most of my contact with President Ford at that time was all on substantive economic issues, and very little to do with foreign policy. In fact, nothing to do with foreign policy, and nothing at that time to do with politics. Now, I do think that President Ford consulted with President Nixon from time to time after the pardon and perhaps during the campaign.
Okay. What differences did you notice between President Ford and President Reagan's leadership styles?
Now, wait a minute. You know something? I've worked for 4 presidents, and I have one rule that I never violate. I never compare presidents, because the minute you say something good about one, it's taken to be a knock on the other. So that's the only question you could ask me that I will not answer.
Okay, folks, we need to change some of the questions that are coming in here, because there are several along those lines. Here's another one related to Reagan, but a different question. Discuss the tension in the White House during the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan.
Well, there was quite a bit of tension. We'd only been there at that time. I was, of course, White House Chief of Staff when President Reagan was shot. We'd only been there for 2 months, I think, or maybe 2.5 months. I believe it was the first week in March. We came in January 20th, so it was a very traumatic time, and nobody really knew at first what had happened. We didn't know. At first, we got conflicting reports as to whether he'd actually been hit. What most people don't know is that President Reagan came very close to dying not from the wound, quite frankly, but from an infection that set in after they had performed surgery on him. And that's probably well known out there now, but at the time it wasn't particularly well known. But it was quite a shock to those of us in the White House. We were new. A lot of us were new to the job, and then to have the president shot in an assassination attempt, you don't know whether you're going to live or not. It's very traumatic, very difficult. It was a very difficult period. One of the things that we did, or I should say didn't do, which has received a lot of attention, is we did not invoke the 25th Amendment, which says that when the president becomes incapacitated, the cabinet is to meet and turn power over to the vice president. Well, the vice president was in Texas when President Reagan was shot. Of course, he got the Secret Service within communication. He got on Air Force Two and was headed back to Washington. I was over at the hospital with other senior White House advisors, and we talked about whether to, and President Reagan was about to go into surgery, and we talked about whether to invoke the 25th Amendment. We concluded it would not be the right thing to do, and because the doctors told us he would only be under the anesthetic for a very short period of time. Remember, this was back in the Cold War when the threat of nuclear conflict was still quite alive. But we didn't think it would be the right thing to do, and I will say this: the Vice President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, was not anxious to see the 25th Amendment invoked, because he had been the last competitor standing against Ronald Reagan in the nomination fight in 1980, and he didn't want people to think somehow he was trying to take over some power. I had been his campaign manager. I was the White House Chief of Staff. If I'd said we're going to invoke the 25th Amendment and give power to George Bush, there might have been a little more than a little muttering in the White House. So we decided not to do that. But I will say this: I had the concurrence of President Reagan's longtime advisors in taking that course. Edwin Meese agreed with me, Len Nofziger, and some others. And as it turned out, everything was fine. Vice President Bush was so conscious of the fact that he had been the last standing competitor that when he came back to Washington, they were going to take the helicopter and land on the South Lawn. He said, "No, you're not. That's where the president lands. I'm not going to land there. We're going to go to the Naval Observatory," which was the vice president's residence.
What was the relationship between President Ford and President Reagan like, especially after the 1976 primary challenge?
Well, you want me to, oh, yeah, that's a comparison question, isn't it? I don't think I'm giving away any secrets to say that not all that good at that time. It later became better. That was a very tough primary, and it's quite natural that with competition like that, there's going to be some tension, and there was some, on both sides. I've written 2 books about my political and public service. The last one was more about my political service, and I was telling Susan earlier, there's a chapter in there where I'm sitting in the Oval Office with President Reagan, just the 2 of us, because I was his chief of staff now even though I ran 2 campaigns against him. Get this. Get this. I was President Ford's delegate hunter in the contest for the nomination against Governor Reagan, and we won. Then I was George H.W. Bush's campaign manager against Ronald Reagan in the fight for the nomination in 1980, and yet Ronald Reagan asked me to be his White House chief of staff. Now, somebody explain that to me. And we were sitting in the White House just reflecting on a lot of these events, and I said, you know, Mr. President, I said, if President Ford had asked you to come on the ticket with him in 1976, it's my opinion he would have been elected. We would have won that election. That 10,000 votes would not have been a problem, and you might never have been president. And he said, that's probably right. He said, but I will tell you this, Jim, if the president had asked me to take that position, I would have felt duty-bound to do it. Now, that's not totally consistent with what the Reagan campaign told the Ford campaign in 1976 when we said, after the nomination fight, we said, let's have a unity meeting. And the Reagan campaign said, we'll have the unity meeting provided you won't ask Governor Reagan to be on the ticket. And we said, okay, because President Ford didn't want to ask him to be on the ticket, and Reagan didn't want to be on the ticket. You ask about the tension, there it was, okay.
What was your biggest challenge as Secretary of State in the Bush 41 administration?
Well, you know, I've said to people that I was an extraordinarily fortunate individual to be Secretary of State when I was. We used to live in a bipolar world where we had the Soviet Union and the United States. It was the Cold War. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, communism Soviet Union imploded, communism collapsed, the wall came down, and we were in a unipolar world. The United States was the only superpower out there, and everybody wanted to get close to Uncle Whiskers. I mean, and I was Secretary of State at the time. My job was a hell of a lot easier because everybody wanted to get close to the only remaining superpower. And so we got a lot of things done. What did we do? We were able to preside over a peaceful end of the Cold War. The Cold War didn't have to end peacefully. It could have ended with a bang instead of a whimper. We had the first Gulf War where we kicked Iraq out of Kuwait with really minimal casualties, and by the way, we got other countries to pay for it. We had the Madrid Peace Conference where Israel and all of her Arab neighbors sat down face to face to talk peace for the first time. We had the unification of Germany and peace and freedom. So a lot of things happened. You asked me what the toughest challenge was. Trying to figure out, I really believe this, trying to figure out where to concentrate, because we were in such a position, we were in a position to get so many things done, and trying to figure out exactly what to concentrate on. I'm not sure we handled the breakup of the former Yugoslavia very well. That was perhaps the greatest challenge.
As Secretary of State, what were your experiences with the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, we were fortunate to be in power when it happened, and I credit every American president, Democrat and Republican, going all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War, for the fact that America was triumphant in the Cold War, because every president, Democrat or Republican, and every administration was steadfast in fighting the Cold War on behalf of the American people, and that's why we ultimately prevailed. I happened to be hosting a lunch in the dining room at the State Department for Corazon Aquino, who was president of the Philippines, when I got a message from the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs saying that the East Germans were going to let people go through the wall. And I could tell that was going to be big stuff, and it was. And by nightfall, it was huge. And so I picked up the phone and called President Bush and excused myself from the dinner and went over to the White House, and we spent the rest of the day over there talking about how we were going to deal with that matter. But I think we did it right. As I said, we continued to work. President Bush, number 41, was smart enough not to dance on the wall. Everybody, the press were all over him saying, why aren't you showing more emotion? You've won a 40-year conflict here, and you're just taking it as a matter of fact. Well, he didn't want to stick it in the eye of Gorbachev and the continuing leadership of the Soviet Union, because he knew we had to continue to work with them to make sure everything ended totally peacefully, and we did that. And one of the most important things we did, I think, was to unify Germany in peace and freedom as a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We didn't have very long to get that done. We had a narrow window of opportunity, but we got it done, and it's still now there's just one Germany, and it's really important that get done in that short time frame.
We're going to go back to a Ford administration question that we talked about a little bit earlier today when we were touring the exhibits. What do you think was the impact of the Helsinki Accords on the Cold War?
I think that's one of the most significant accomplishments of President Ford, and that is has really been underreported and underappreciated. The Helsinki Accords gave everyone who wanted to support freedom for captive people of Eastern and Central Europe or elsewhere in Arab countries, gave them a raison d'etre, if you will, to argue for freedom and human rights and individual freedoms for people, because that's some of the things that were contained in the Helsinki Accords. As I told you when we were touring the exhibits, one of the things that was in the Accords, though, that has been observed by its breach is a provision in the Helsinki Accords saying that borders will only be changed through peaceful means. That was one of the problems we had in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. These countries wanted, Slovenia, Croatia, some of them wanted to declare independence, seize the border posts around them. And I went over to Belgrade and I said, if you do this, you're going to kick off one heck of a civil war. There were Yugoslavia was only kept together by the authoritarianism and totalitarianism of Tito. So once they started agitating for separation, we told them we thought it was going to end up in a big civil war, and it did. But the Helsinki Accords was a very, very important achievement of President Ford's administration.
Help us understand why Bush 41 was not successful in being reelected.
Well, I would say there are three reasons. First of all, he had a sorry campaign manager, me. But secondly, there were three reasons. We'd been there 12 years, okay? I mean, 2 Reagan terms. Bush was Reagan's vice president. We'd been there 2 Reagan terms, that's 8 years, and 1 Bush term. The press, particularly, were tired of us. They really were tired of us, and we were climbing a tough mountain. There was another major problem. That's reason number one. I think a lot of people were tired of us. We've been there 12 years. It's very hard to keep the White House for more than 8 years for any party. If you go back and look at history, there are not many times where it's happened. And we had kept it for 12. Secondly, we had a little jug-eared fellow from Texas named Ross Perot that you may or may not have heard of. And Ross Perot took 19% of the vote. Clinton got 43%, Bush got 38%, and Perot got 19%. And our polling showed us that Perot was taking 2 out of every 3 of his votes from us. You take 2/3 of 19 and add it to 38, and we have 51. And when people tell me, "Oh, he didn't cost you the election," I just say, "Well, I'm sorry, I think he did." And I'll say it again. I've thought he did for 20 years, and I still think he did. But the third thing was our fault, absolutely, and that is instead of going up to Capitol Hill in January of 1992, when President Bush 41 was at 90% approval rating, and saying, okay, Desert Storm was a great success. Now we're going to do domestic storm. And I'm going to focus on the domestic problems facing this country. And here's an economic program that's going to get that done. If we had done that, I think we might have won that election notwithstanding Ross Perot. But we didn't do that, and that was a mistake.
Let's talk about another election, and this is the one in 2000 with the vote recount. We have 2 questions about what are the common misperceptions about the events surrounding the recount, and just another on that same. Could you discuss that?
I can discuss the recount. I don't know what people's misconceptions are about it. I can tell you a few factual things. Number one, we were never behind in any count whatsoever, ever of all the counts that were taken. The press went in and all the hanging chads and ballots were all saved in the New York Times, Miami, a Miami paper, I can't remember which one. These are not exactly fans of Republican candidates often. They went and did their own survey of these ballots, and they said under no scenario could Gore have won after they looked at those ballots. So there's a fairly independent look at it. I think that I used to say that after the 1976 election, where we lost by only 10,000 votes out of 81 million, I remember thinking to myself that night at 3:30 in the morning, boy, is this something? This is this is going to be the closest presidential election of your lifetime. Well, it wasn't the closest presidential election of my life. 537 votes. But a couple of other things I'll say about that, in addition to the fact that we never were behind, we never lost a recount, we were never behind in the count, we won any number of court cases, and yes, we won the Supreme Court, the final case. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you were just given the presidency on a 5-4 decision of the United States Supreme Court. That's simply not true. The vote on constitutionality in that case in the Supreme Court of the United States was 7-2. Justice Breyer, a Democrat, voted with the Republicans, and Justice Souter voted with a dissenting Democrat, I think Justice Ginsburg. So you, in effect, had a bipartisan decision on constitutionality. And then they took up the question of remedy after they said that the scheme that the Florida legislature has put in place for recount is illegal, unconstitutional. Then they said the time has expired for further recount because by Gore's own admission, the critical date was December 12th, and this was December 11th. They said there's no longer any time to count. The Gore campaign made a big mistake when they asked for recounts in only 4 counties. And they were pro-Democratic counties, all of them, very heavy Democratic counties. And they asked for recount instead of a statewide recount. They should have come in. So when they did that, that gave us the high ground. And their mantra was, count every vote, count every vote. Our mantra was, look, we've counted them 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, and every time we count them, we win. And so finally the Supreme Court said, yep, that's right. But the Supreme Court also said that the Florida legislature could not change the rules of the game after the game had started. And under the Constitution, the legislatures of the various states have the ability to determine how presidential electors are selected. And Florida had a law, but once all this recount business started and all these multiplicity of lawsuits, and by the way, we had a whole lot of lawsuits, I mean, maybe hundreds. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't change the rules of the game after it started.
You'll be pleased to know that we're going to move from the presidents with whom you've worked to some current affairs questions. Following the post-Cold War euphoria, how and when did things go wrong, leading to the difficult situation the U.S. finds itself in today?
Well, I don't buy the assumption that the United States is in decline. I mean, you go out and you read the papers today, everybody's right, oh, it's terrible, we're in just such bad shape. If we're in such bad shape, why is it everybody wants to come here? Nobody wants to go anywhere else. We're not in good shape today. We have some humongous problems. Our big debt bomb out there, we have debt to GDP of over 100% programmed for the next 5 years. That's unsustainable. We continue to spend beyond our means. We've got to find a way to do something about that. But I don't buy the argument that we're on the downhill slide. When I was Treasury Secretary for President Reagan in 1986, the Japanese were coming into the United States buying up everything. Remember, they were buying up Radio City, and everybody was saying, well, America's down the tube. Japan Inc. is going to own the world. Guess what? It didn't happen. And they've just had 15 years of terrible economic times. We got a lot of things going for us that others don't. You know, people compare us to China. Well, China's growth is really a very amazing thing. It's important. We need to acknowledge it. It's significant. But we've got some strengths that they don't have. And one of them is our political system. Our principles and our ideals. Does anybody out there doubt that our political system is going to be any different years from now than it is today? And would anybody hazard the same guess about China's? I don't think so. So I don't buy all this stuff about how the United States is in terminal or permanent decline. We do have some serious problems. We've got to figure out how to stop all this spending. We've got to live within our means, and that means we've got to deal with everything: defense, entitlements, revenue, the whole deal. But I will tell you one other thing that I learned from 8 years of service to President Reagan. You don't resolve a deficit problem just by raising taxes. You do need revenue. But if you don't have spending restraint, I mean legal spending restraint, you can raise taxes till the cows come home and you'll never deal with a deficit because Congress will spend the money you raise in taxes and then they'll spend more. And the only time we've ever gotten a handle on it to any extent really was during the George H.W. Bush administration when we had spending restraint, legal spending restraint, enforceable spending restraint in the form of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings restraints. So we got a lot of problems, but I don't buy the argument that something terrible has happened to us. That's simply not true. We ought not to worry about the fact that Brazil and India and China are moving up in the world. And I think it's more a case of they're moving up than the United States going down. Why are they moving up? They're moving up because these countries have embraced our paradigm of free market economics. And we ought to welcome that. Yes, they're competitors now. They didn't used to be, some of them. And we will have to compete with them. But I think we're positioned to compete with them very effectively.
How do you view the results of the Iraq Study Group report applying to U.S. foreign policy during the Arab Spring?
Well, I don't know that I've even thought about it in comparison to the Arab Spring. What we said was that at the time we took a look at it, we went over there. We were given full access to all of our policymakers, CIA, all the others. And what we said was the situation. This was in December of 2006. We said the situation in Iraq is grave and deteriorating, and it was. And the administration took some, and by the way, we had a provision in the Iraq Study Group report supporting a surge, provided it was short-term and provided that the commanders on the ground recommended it. Well, that's what the president ended up doing. And it turned out to be, to some extent and degree, successful. But I got to tell you, I think the jury is still out a bit on what the final result is going to be in Iraq. It's certainly a lot better than it was when we went over there in 2006. But I don't think we've seen the end of it yet, and I hope that things don't degenerate after we are fully out of there at the end of this year. But we are coming out. It's over. I just hope, and certainly the world is better off to be rid of Saddam Hussein, but we don't know yet what the final situation is going to be. We don't know the extent to which Iran may be emboldened and strengthened by what's happened there. And so I think the one thing the Iraq Study Group report did was to focus the attention of policymakers and the country to some extent on the fact that we needed to change what we were doing in there. And we needed to find a way to do a better job of training Iraqi forces so that we ultimately could leave. We can't stay in all these countries forever. Same is true with Afghanistan.
In your role as a former Secretary of State, could you give us a thumbnail State of the Union, particularly as it is related to national security risks for our country?
Well, we still have significant national security risks. One of the things, of course, the terrorism risk is still very much out there. We got to remain very vigilant about that. We are targets. We need to understand it. Cyber warfare is a vulnerability, in my view, of the United States. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that. I don't know to what extent we are in a position to defend against cyber warfare. I think it is important for us to remember that throughout recent history, in any event, our alliances have helped the United States. You look at the United States and China. We have a web of alliances out there all across the world, whether it's in Asia or in Europe or where it might be, of people that'll help us share the burden with the freedom-loving countries. That's a strength of ours. We need to make sure we keep those strong. How we react, how we relate to the Arab Spring is important. That is a That is a really big thing that's happening out there. Again, we don't know what the final result is that's going to be. I'll tell you this, if the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty blows up, you can forget about a Israeli-Palestinian deal. It won't happen if that peace treaty. And we don't know who's going to run Egypt. I mean, it's still very much up in the air. We don't know what's going to end up happening in Libya, whether that's going to be a civil war or whether it's going to be something else. Syria is a terrible problem now, and so and Yemen. But as far as the threat of terrorism, it doesn't just come from Afghanistan. Somalia, Yemen, other places like that.
Last question, and I thank whoever submitted this. Why didn't you ever run for president? We think you would have been a great one.
I thought about it. My time would have been 1996, but I had in the years just before that, I had done 2 stints as chief of staff in the White House for 2 different presidents. I'd been Secretary of the Treasury for 4 years, Secretary of State for 4 years, and I had worked on or led at a fairly high level 5 campaigns for president by 3 Republican presidents, and I was dead tired. Pete Sekian knows how tired I was. I was dead tired. My wife and I talked about it. I think we could have raised the money, but I was 66 years old too at that time, and we didn't have it in us, and it was. I've never looked back on that decision. It was the right decision, and I'm very happy with it. But I'm particularly happy to be back here in Grand Rapids to stand up for somebody that I will always, all of my life, admire and honor, Jerry Ford. Thank you all very much.